teaching and scholarship, and in 2006 was designated as one of the 10 best law professors in Illinois by Chicago Lawyer magazine. She also has taught at Tulane Law School and is a frequent visiting professor at the Rasner Law School in Israel, where she teaches a course on the American Jewish movement and Jewish law. She is a keen observer of the American Jewish community and has also written numerous op-eds and articles on topics of general interest. Her popular writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, and most of the major Jewish media venues such as the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Commentary Magazine, the Jerusalem Report, the Jerusalem Post, the Forward, the Jewish Week, the Lair House, the Jewish Journal, Feller, and the Jewish Philanthropy. My daily read. She's a frequent speaker about Jewish law and culture at synagogues and for Jewish organizations in the United States and Israel. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
For learning with you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Hi to the people who are live streaming. We have a very intimate group here present in the synagogue. So I think I'm going to take this as an opportunity to do something a little bit different from what I've normally done in my book talks. I promise that I will, of course, give you a very good flavor for what the book is about and why I wrote the book and why the book is important. But I think, listen, we are at a point in the world right now, for most of the time that I was writing this book, I submitted the manuscript, probably June of 2020, right? So I was writing it for 3 years before that. And for most of that time, of course, we had issues in the world, but nothing like what we're dealing with now. And so at some level, you turn on the news, and it doesn't matter which channel you turn on, but you turn on the news and you almost
I'm so not a Mac person, so this is not good. A non-Mac person, I mean.
Do you want to maybe just shut the live stream off until
I have paused it, so there we go.
Okay, so we're not streaming now, so it's just
Right, I'm just gonna go get Rebecca.
Yeah.
Recording.
Should I wait for you to pull it up?
I'm sorry.
Was recording?
Sounds like it's recording. I don't know.
Okay. What is that? Is that the one?
And they always need it.
Well, especially because in a mask, it's hard. We're still teaching in a mask at Kwall, but I have a different kind of a mask, which makes it. This is not a mask to speak in.
You can take your mask off. You're far enough away from us. It's absolutely fine.
Much.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, you have a Zoom here.
We take ours off.
Oh, I don't. I mean,
We are a small group. Yeah. Let's get it.
yeah. I'm totally fine. I figured that we went okay. Most of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have another kind that looks ridiculous, but it's actually much easier to speak in. And I have 100 students in my classes. So it's a big room and it's hard to project, but I have like a pouch and 95. So it's not like that. It's a different. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look great. It's not great for the hair, but it doesn't. All right. So we're
Go ahead. We're not recording right now. We're going to see if we can pick it up, but you can.
Okay. All right. So as I was saying, this is I'm finding this a really difficult time, and I'm sure everyone obviously is as well. And so it sometimes makes the issue that I am most concerned about, which is transmission of Jewish tradition, and what will Jewish tradition look like in the non-Orthodox communities in the next, 20, 30 years and beyond. It sort of makes that issue feel, okay, sure, but turn the TV on and you get overwhelmed, right? At least I get overwhelmed with what we're facing globally. And it's really, really, it's really difficult. But having said that, I want to go back. You said that you read EJP, E-Jewish Philanthropy, every day. So I published something in there about 2 weeks ago. And I want to start with, again, I'm being much more impromptu than I typically don't speak from a script anyway, but I'm actually being very much more freeform with this than I typically do, because we have a very small group. I don't think I've had such a small group, and it gives us a good idea for opportunity for conversation and to have more dialogue than I normally do. I normally do like a 25-minute talk and then 30 minutes of conversation, but I think I'm going to change that up for this group because we're so into it. So in that article that I just published in E-Jewish Philanthropy, my main point was that Jewish organizations, including synagogues and institutions, need to focus on the low-hanging fruit, more on the low-hanging fruit. So who is the low-hanging fruit, right? I heard you just say your daughter is getting married and an official Muslim ties to you. The low-hanging fruit, in my view, the low-hanging fruit are the groups of younger Jews. There are some of them are Gen X. Those Gen X were born, basically 1995 to 2010. So most of the students sitting in my classes are Gen X. Many of them are Gen X, of course, millennials. The youngest of Gen Z. Gen Z is the 1995 to 2010. I apologize, I misspoke. Gen X are their parents. All right. So the low-hanging fruit, in my view, would be the older Gen Z, the ones born closer to 95, who are now in law school in their early 20s or other professional school, college in their early 20s. Okay. Millennials, of course, right? And then the youngest of the Gen Xers, who are the parents, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. And so what do we know about the low-hanging fruit? What do I know about the low-hanging fruit? Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit with you about what the past 2 years of my book launch has been. It's my book published right before COVID, like literally right before COVID. I remember like literally a week before doing a talk at Kwall with Sarah Hurwitz, who wrote the book Here All Along. She's Michelle Obama's former speechwriter. We met independently. She was in Chicago. We did a joint program at DePaul at 7:30 in the morning, had about 30 young women. It was for JWI, Jewish Women's International. And it was such a wonderful event. But even then, I remember there were plate fruit trays out, because breakfast for the young women. And I remember thinking, I think I'll take a piece of cantaloupe from the very back. Even then, it was March 4th. And we knew what was coming, but it wasn't clear yet, right? So those women that were sitting in that, class at 7:30 that morning on March 4th. Those are the low-hanging fruit because they are Jewishly involved. They're not religious necessarily, but they're Jewishly involved enough to come at 7:30 in the morning on weekday to DePaul University College of Law to hear a book talk by myself and Sarah Hurwitz. That's the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit are the people in the young leadership group of the Federation. Again, they're not religious. They're not necessarily keeping Shabbat. Maybe they're celebrating Shabbat at best, but they're not keeping Shabbat. They're not necessarily keeping all the laws of keeping kosher, in any of the laws of keeping kosher, but they're Jewishly connected, right? You go to any major city, and we have a good group of low-hanging fruit here in Chicago. Chicago has a great federation, and it's got a great Jewish community. There are low-hanging fruit. You go to small cities, there are low-hanging fruit. These are the people that when they have children, they are raising their children as Jewish by religion. Why is that significant? Why that is significant is because when I started writing about Jewish law and Jewish culture, and 2 of my 3 major books are on Judaism, squarely on Judaism, we started seeing reports come out by the Pew Institute. How many of you know about the Pew reports, right? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so for those, all right, but some of you don't. So it's important to know what the Pew reports do. Sure, the first Pew report came out in 2013. I was finishing up the book, The Myth of the Cultural Jew at the time. When that Pew report came out, Pew was the entity that coined Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, right? So that's a Pewism, right? It was coined, that term was coined by Pew. And today we use it as though it's common parlance in the sociological world, but it really comes from the Pew report. And what we learned in the 2013 Pew report, which was verified again by the 2020 Pew report, is that a quarter of the Jews in the United States are Jews of no religion, meaning they're Jewish just in name, possibly ancestry, nothing more. They don't identify religiously with Judaism. They're not involved in Jewish causes. They don't go to Jewish charities. They're not necessarily raising their kids as Jewish. That's 25%. What the 2020 Pew report showed, and that just came out in May of 2021, right? It was a year delayed because of COVID, but it's called the 2020 Pew report. We learned that among younger Jews, and that cohort being 18 to 29, that's the youngest cohort that the Pew report studied, that basically the number of Jews of no religion is escalating, so that what we are heading into right now is a world in which this is what the American Jewish community looks like. And I can talk about Israel if you'd like in the Q&A. Israel is different issues, different challenges, but it's different from what I'm describing. We are now heading into a world in which the American Jewish community is going to look like this, split into one group that is very, very observant, right? Observing everything in increasing stringency, right? And that's our Orthodox brethren, okay? And the rest basically doing nothing. That's scary. That should be scary for anyone who is sitting in this room, for anyone who has attended any of my talks over the past 2 years, right? It's scary because what it means is what we have, what you have here, you can't necessarily count on perpetuating without more being done. And so my piece in E-Jewish Philanthropy was basically a call to synagogues and to other Jewish organizations saying, look, we have to turn this around. The clergy has to help turn it around. Those who are staffing Jewish organizations and working at Jewish institutions have to help turn it around. And parents need to help turn it around, and so do grandparents. And in this group today, I have a feeling I have some grandparents at least, right? Grandparents also have a huge job in trying to turn the tide, because if we don't, think about even what the Jewish organizational world is going to look like. Who are going to be members of organizations like Lord and Hadassah, just to name a couple, right? I spoke to Hadassah as my first in-person event that I did. It was over the summer, and it was great turnout. And I said to the ladies there, if the trends continue, who will be members of Hadassah? There won't be people. Because what we are seeing is for Jews that are not connected and raising their kids as Jewish by religion, they're not interested in Jewish causes. And what do the Jews by religion look like? So this is where we get close to Remixed Judaism, right? And by the way, Remixed Judaism just launched in paperback. So I think what you have back there are the paperback versions. I was happy my publisher decided to issue a paperback. It's less expensive for one thing than the hardcover was. But I also wrote a new preface to it based on research I had done, including the 2020 Pew report that I had just mentioned. All right, so what do the Jews of religion look like? Now, I'm not talking about the Jews of no religion. Now let's talk about those Jews by religion, all right? Now, take the Orthodox out of it, okay? Because they operate under a different set of norms with a different set of practices. And transmission in Orthodoxy is, anybody want to take a guess at what the fallout rate is in Orthodoxy? Pew documented this as well, right? So any Orthodox, anything from modern Orthodox, all the way to what we call Haredi, the ultra Orthodox. What do you think the rate of people who go off?
Generations, one generation for that.
Just currently,
Less
the
than
Pew
10%. Less than 10%.
No, good guess, but no,
15 to 20.
no. One more guess. Lori, do you want to guess?
I was going to say 30 to 40. Because
Maybe you looked at the Pew data. It was 30.
I did read the Pew report,
Yeah, it's 30.
and it was shocking.
Right. I was shocked at that. 30% is like, who are all these Orthodox people that are, deflecting? Because pretty much what I know in Orthodox families is that the kids stay Orthodox. 30% is a lot. Okay. But now let's look at the Jews of religion. So they say, when Pew says, what's your religion? The Jews by religion say Jewish. They're not necessarily saying in these questions, do you light Shabbat candles? Do you celebrate the holidays? That's not what they're saying. They're just saying, what is your religion? Okay. So this is what the Jews by religion, other than the Orthodox, look like. Are they lighting Shabbat candles? In the conservative movement, which has bigger traditional cultural norms. By that, I mean more observance overall than does Reform. Those are just the statistics. That's not surprising. I mean, we can talk, I know this is Reform from the synagogue. I've learned a ton about Reform in writing this book and also in my talks. I've met the most wonderful Reform rabbis and worked with wonderful synagogue leaders in the Reform movement. And there's a lot to be proud of in the movement. But talking about lighting candles regularly, 30% of conservative Jews do, regularly meaning, once or twice a month, not even every Shabbat. It's less than Reform. Keeping kosher, meaning do you keep a kosher home, which can be interpreted in many different ways, right? Everybody has their own definition of kosher. I think the conservative movement, again, roughly 25, 30 maybe, it's certainly less than Reform. So when we're talking about Jews by religion, what are we talking about? So look at the low-hanging fruit, right? Maybe this will sound familiar to some of you who know low-hanging fruit, who are younger or have kids who fall in this category. Are they going to shul on Shabbos? Not so much. Maybe when they have kids, they'll schlep them along for Touch Shabbat occasionally, right? Are they keeping kosher homes? Usually not, maybe kosher style. Are they sending your kids to Jewish preschool? Yeah, a lot of them are. Jewish preschools are doing pretty well, at least prior to COVID. I don't know what current statistics look like. Are they joining synagogues? Well, that's still a challenge because synagogues are expensive, but I think a lot of them are or will be inclined to join synagogues, okay? That's our low-hanging fruit. That is our best hope for transmitting Jewish tradition. It's the low-hanging fruit. So a lot of the discourse institutionally in synagogues, and I'm talking about all synagogues, not my own included, but it's across the board, have to do with issues that are not necessarily geared toward transmitting Jewish tradition, or how do we go about doing it in a non-Orthodox framework, right? So pretty much every talk I have done, and that's probably about 120 or 30, all Reform, conservative, or reconstructing Jewish. Okay, reconstructive, former Reconstructionist movement. Okay, so there's a lot of synagogues of those compositions. I've spoken at about maybe 120 of them. So that's a lot, but there's still a lot out there. What are the topics that most synagogues are interested in? Politics. Anti-Semitism, which is important. All of this is important. But if we don't have Jews, we're not going to have an anti-Semitism problem, right? We're only going to have that problem if we have Jews. We need to be thinking more about transmission. So why did I write Remixed Judaism? I wrote Remixed Judaism because my last book, The Myth of the Cultural Jew, is really about a history of halakha. It's about a history of Jewish law, which shows how The Myth of the Cultural Jew is an academic book. It was published by Oxford Press, has a lot of footnotes. And basically, The Myth of the Cultural Jew is about how halakha, Jewish law, has been shaped by cultural norms of the Jews, both in the Jewish communities and in the communities, the non-Jewish communities where the Jews were living in exile, right? So we see this synergy. It's a book that law and culture are deeply intertwined. You can't understand Jewish law without understanding Jewish culture, as well as the cultures of the Jews in the places where the Jews have lived. All right, again, it's an academic book. The second to last chapter was on American Judaism, and Pew came out right as I was finishing that chapter. And I said to my mentor, who was, basically, reading every chapter for me and giving me feedback, I said, wow, I really want to write something about American Judaism and how we have to turn this around. And he said to me very wisely, Bobby, save that for another book. You're doing enough in this book. And he was right, because The Myth of the Cultural Jew is an academic book, really. It was read by people who were not Jewish, studies professors or rabbis or Jewish law scholars. But by and large, it was written with a more academic focus to it. But I wanted to write something to a wide audience that really underscored the gravity of our situation, because the Pew 2013 report caused a lot of hand-wringing in the Jewish world. You remember that. Everybody was writing articles. What are we going to do? How are we going to turn this around? And did they turn it around in 7 years? No, we've had a lot of challenges in 7 years, of course. However, the truth of the matter is we're still grappling with what this is going to look like. And it's not necessarily an optimistic view. So some people would say, well, people are reinventing Judaism. Young people are finding their own ways. Social justice is a big thing for young people. That's how they express their Judaism, and that's great. But if you don't have the particulars of Jewish tradition, there is no Judaism to transmit. Okay, so prior to COVID, my family always enjoyed working in the soup kitchens through the Federation program. And we did that. We worked at a lot of soup kitchens in Chicago. We've not done it since COVID, I'll be honest. But every time we went, we would see groups from churches, which is great too. The point is, that kind of work is not unique to Judaism. It may be grounded in Jewish sources, which of course it is. And I have a chapter in Remix Judaism that talks about Tikkun Olam as being the most celebrated remix, because it certainly is among liberally religious Jews, but it's not sufficient if you care about transmission of the tradition. My main focus in Remix Judaism is coming up with a plan with some guidance for how non-Orthodox Jews can incorporate more meaningful practice of Judaism into their lives, and how they can transmit that to those who want to transmit it down the line to their kids and to their grandkids. So I start with the premise that when it comes to why people practice, the narrative in religiously liberal circles, I define that, by the way, religiously liberal in its conventional definition, which is the conservative movement all the way to the left, right? So conservative Jews, so they, purport to adhere to halakha, to Jewish law. It's still considered liberally religious, as is Reform, as is Reconstructing Judaism, as is Humanistic Judaism, and then on and on and on. Okay, anything other than Orthodoxy is basically how I'm defining liberally religious. Okay. Liberally religious Jews do not observe, I believe, for the same reason that Orthodox Jews do. The majority of Orthodox Jews observe what they do because they believe it's commanded by God. Now, are there some Orthodox Jews who are what we call orthoprax, and they observe, but they're not, the commandedness isn't necessarily uppermost in their mind? Sure. And that's been written about a lot, actually, by, the social Orthodox, right? It's a thing, and it has been written about. But the majority of Orthodox Jews do operate and do what they do based on a sense of faith that this is what God wants of us, right? That's not how it works for the majority of liberally religious Jews. Many older liberally religious Jews actually may do what they do because they were brought up in a different sort of environment with a little bit more ritual, and it has good memories. And that's great. That's different from being commanded, but that does drive a lot. But then for the majority of liberally religious Jews, they're only going to practice if it matters to them, if it means something to them, if there's a personal meaning. So Remix Judaism is really about, first of all, selecting what you want to practice, because liberally religious Jews are not going to be observing everything in its entirety. It is the reality that Pew shows us. It's the reality on the ground, anecdotally. It is the reality. So there's a lot of picking and choosing. Clearly, we want people to pick and choose more than less, but there's going to be picking and choosing. But it's important that people infuse what they do practice with their own personal meaning in the rituals, because if it means something to you, you will do it. And you will do it consistently. And consistency is so important when it comes to transmission. You can't really transmit a sense of Judaism if all you're doing is lighting a few Hanukkah candles in December and a Passover Seder, come March or April, right? It's just not enough to create a transmission of the tradition. You need to do more, and you need to do it consistently, which is why Shabbat is the ultimate way to transmit, because it comes every week and it allows us an opportunity, even if you're not completely observing the laws of Shabbat, to bring Shabbat into your home and to introduce it to your kids and to introduce it to your grandkids with joy. Joy is another really important part of Remix Judaism. Kids, little kids, but even teenagers don't respond well to, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, we don't do this. No, you don't do that. It doesn't work well. What does work well is, well, today is Shabbat. We're going to light our candles. We're going to sing our songs. We're going to have special yummy food. That is the joy. And there's a lot of joyfulness in the Jewish tradition. So much joyfulness. Also, mindfulness and intentionality is really important to Remix Judaism. Actually, to my surprise, Remix Judaism was endorsed by 3 Orthodox rabbis, one of whom was Ari Hart here in Chicago, but also a lot of Orthodox people have told me they really like the attention to mindfulness and intentionality that I emphasize in the book, because I do emphasize an approach that really looks at how mindful you're being. You're not just going through the motions, you're actually being mindful about what you choose to practice and what you don't choose to practice. And so that's something that, you know, Orthodox people have told me Orthodoxy could actually use, could consider a little bit more that notion of mindfulness. It's not as present according to what some people have told me about Orthodox communities. It's a little bit more rote because you're doing everything all the time. And so that does make sense. Lastly, I think what's really important about Remix Judaism is the idea of having respect for the tradition. Right, having respect for the tradition. So you can't hope to transmit a sense of positivity about Judaism unless you yourself are coming from a sense of positivity. And so with that, I want to just read one narrative in my book that I have a lot of narrative that I use throughout the book. What do I mean by narrative? Well, some of it is narrative from the Torah. Some of it is what we call Talmudic Agadah, meaning narrative from the Talmud. And the Talmud is basically at least 25% narrative, not just law or legal positions or legal discussions, but actual stories. And the stories from the Talmud, I think, are the best teaching tools. So when I quote Talmudic narrative in Remix Judaism, I actually use a direct translation of the Aramaic, because it's usually Aramaic that I'm translating. I don't summarize my Talmudic passages. I actually do a direct translation because I want my readers to be absorbed in the world of the Talmud and the world of the rabbis and the sages who wrote the Talmud. And some of it is autobiographical, and some of it come from stories that I've read. So what I'd like to do, and actually what I'd like to do in the remaining time, is I want to read you a couple of passages from Remix Judaism. I want to give you a couple examples of Remix Judaism that can concretize the elements that I just said, and then I would love to throw it out for discussion and commentary and whatnot. So I'm going to actually start not with the narrative that I wanted to read, but I'm going to start with a Talmudic passage. This Talmudic passage to me encapsulates why Remix Judaism is so important and why we need it. This actually comes from the tractate Ta'anit in the Babylonian Talmud. The narrative features a character who's somewhat prominent in the Torah, in the Talmud rather. His name is Honi. He's otherwise known as the circle maker, and that has to do with having rain. If he would draw a circle and rain would come down. There's a lot of narratives involving Honi, but this one involves something else. All right, and I think you'll see where I'm going as to why I think this narrative is significant. Okay, one day Honi was journeying on the road, and he saw a man planting a carob tree. He asked him, "How long does it take for this tree to bear fruit?" The man replied, 70 years. He then further asked him, "Are you certain you will live another 70 years?" The man replied, "I found ready-grown carob trees in the world. As my forefathers planted these for me, so too do I plant them for my children." When he sat down to have a meal, and sleep overcame him. He continued to sleep for another 70 years. This is Talmudic Agadah narrative, so take the timing with a little bit of a grain of salt here, not meant to be literal. But then when he woke up, he saw a man gathering the fruit of the carob tree, and he asked him, "Are you the man who planted the tree?" And the man replied, "I am his grandson." Now that is a beautiful, beautiful narrative. What is it teaching us? First of all, it's teaching us that it is the responsibility of one generation to plant the fruit for the next generation. And secondly, it's teaching us, this is my own interpretation, that Jewish tradition can be likened to the fruit of the carob tree. We always want Jewish tradition in the world, just like we always want carob fruit. But the carob fruit and the tradition and its application, they look a little different and taste a little different and feel a little different from one generation to another, but we always want there to be carob fruit and Jewish tradition in this world. I think this narrative really embodies the essence and the spirit of Remix Judaism. Now, I mentioned before that one of the things that's really important, especially for transmission, is coming from a sense of respect for the tradition, even if you're not completely observant. And so this narrative is actually, this particular narrative comes in my chapter on food. And this is an autobiographical one. It's about my dad. I vividly recall a story my father, who had been raised in a very Orthodox home, often shared with me as I was growing up. There was a trade, non-kosher hot dog stand near his elementary school that he always found very tempting. One day, he just gave in and bought a hot dog on his way home from school. But that particular day, his mother fixed him bananas, cottage cheese, and sour cream for lunch, which he had no choice but to eat because he did not want to tell her he had eaten the non-kosher hot dog. So my father's first infraction of the dietary laws not only involved eating non-kosher meat, the hot dog, but also mixing meat and milk by consuming the dairy too soon after the meat. Now, he was probably 7 or 8 years old by the time when this happened to him. And by the time I was able to hear and understand the story, it was at least 35 years later. It was a long time. But his sense of guilt was still palpably clear to me all those years later. Now, this story is all the more interesting because at that time, our home was not exactly kosher, but more kosher style. And my father was not particularly strict about observing the dietary laws. But the story was my first introduction to kashrut. It was how I learned first that certain meats are not kosher and that mixing meat and milk is prohibited. I also learned, even if not on a conscious level, that these rules represented a fundamental part of what it means to be Jewish. Even though my father was not keeping kosher when he recounted this narrative, he was very clear to me about how important being Jewish was to him and that therefore it should also be important to me. Now, I can't say for sure whether hearing this story repeatedly during my childhood was a factor in my decision to begin keeping kosher shortly before my bar mitzvah. I do think it played a part. Respect for the tradition. It's important. It's important regardless of the observance. So what are a couple examples of remixed Judaism? And then I'll tell you about the chapter, what I cover in the book, and we'll throw it out for discussion. So one of my favorite illustrations, actually, of remixed Judaism actually involved a story that is not in the book because it happened after the book went to press. I have 3 daughters. My middle daughter called me up one day. This was right before COVID as well. And she said, "Mom, I want to tell you something. Jeremy," her at the time boyfriend, now husband, "he's not eating pig anymore." And I'm like, "Oh, Baruch Hashem, thank you." Because, I keep a strictly kosher home. And while my kids are not strictly kosher, the idea of having pork in their homes when my grandkids will, one day be roaming around that home is not exciting to me, I will be honest. So I just said, "Oh, Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so glad. Does Jeremy want to connect more with his Jewish tradition?" And she goes, "No, not at all." I said, "Oh, okay, well, that's still good. So what's motivating this change of behavior?" And she said, "Well, he feels badly for the animals." And I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, that's good. It's good. That's still a good thing." And I said, "But so is he giving up all meat then?" And she said, "Oh, no, just pork, just anything pig." I was so confused. And I said, "Okay, Rachel, I don't understand. This is all good. I'm not being critical, but what's going on here?" She goes, "Mom, don't you know? The pigs, they're treated so much worse than the cows are." I burst out laughing. I mean, it was too much for me. I couldn't keep it in. I said, "Rach, it's still a good thing." She goes, "But he's not doing it for the right reason." And I said, "Well, there is no right reason." I said, "Read my book that's coming out in a couple months." And she was laughing. I said, there is really no right reason. What he's doing something that means something to him, which means he'll keep doing it, right? And if you think about, there's a wonderful book that was published by the CCAR Press, the Reform Movements Press, edited by Rabbi Mary Zamor, called The Sacred Table. I read that book cover to cover one winter when I was writing remixed Judaism and working on the chapter on food. What The Sacred Table is an anthology of stories as to how Reform rabbis came to basically approach their kashrut journeys. And there's some wonderful stories in it. And certainly respect for the animals is one of the themes of that book, as is respect for workers, as is, all health reasons. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people attempt to some degree to keep kosher, right? And so it doesn't really matter what your reasons are. And I said that to my daughter. And I said, one day when you have kids, by the way, she was not pregnant. So one day when you have kids, you'll say to your kids, look, daddy does it for this reason. Dee Dee, that's me, does it for this reason. But the point is we're doing it. And she goes, and that's okay? I said, yeah, that's okay. And it's funny because one of the main things I've learned as I've traveled, mostly by Zoom, throughout the country in North America, is that there's a lot of concern in Reform and conservative synagogues with, are we doing it wrong? It's really interesting how many people are so concerned with the idea of, are we doing things wrong? And one of the premises of Remix Judaism is that, well, yes, there is right and wrong. And what you do does have to tap into the authenticity of the tradition. Remix Judaism is not a book about anything those, but you have latitude, right? You have latitude. So here's another remix story. This one was actually appeared in our JUF magazine here in Chicago, and it was written by a young mom here in the Chicago area. And at the time, she had 3 boys in Jewish preschool. She would describe herself as a cultural Jew, even though I've said that's a myth. That's how she would describe herself. She belongs to a Reform synagogue in Highland Park, and she talked about her boys being afraid to go to sleep at night. They were having bad dreams. So she would lay down with each one, and she would sing with them the first line of the Shema. And it settled them down, and they got calm, and they were able to go to sleep and have nice dreams. And now the boys are all in grade school, and they do it to themselves. They say that first line to themselves. That's remix. Why is it a remix? Well, there is a version of the Shema that religious Jews say before they go to bed at night. That is authentic. That is an authentically Jewish practice. This is not why she did it. She wasn't thinking about the religion piece. She was wanting to settle her boys down. But she did it consistently. It was meaningful to her. It was meaningful to her boys. They're still doing it. And I have this vision that perhaps when her boys have children of their own, this is something that they might, do with their own. So those are just 2 examples of remixed Judaism. Of course, people ask me all the time, if there was only one thing you would recommend for people to incorporate, what would it be? And as I hinted before, what it would have to do with Shabbat. And Shabbat is my first substantive chapter after the introduction, because Shabbat holidays give us an opportunity to really exercise remix on a consistent basis. Think about what the Pew report that I've described to you would look like if every Jewish or even partially Jewish family would take 1 hour on Friday night and light the nerot, light the candles, and say the bracha, make the blessing over the wine and the challah, and have a 1-hour technology-free dinner. If all families were doing even that much, that Pew report would look completely different. So it's important to meet people where they are. It's important to incorporate practices with mindfulness, with intentionality, with consistency, and with joy. And it's important if you want to be transmitting Jewish tradition, it's important to take these steps and to talk about them. So in the book, as I hope you will see, I do start with Shabbat in the introduction. I do start with Shabbat and holidays, and then I have the chapter on food. The chapter on food really does look at the role of food in Jewish tradition. So of course, kashrut is a major piece of it, but I talk about a lot of reasons why people can and do observe some, and why some element of Jewish food is significant. The chapter after food is the chapter on marriage. That was the hardest chapter for me, right? You cannot write a book like this without talking not just about Jewish marriage, but also intermarriage. Intermarriage outside of the Orthodox community is 72% in the United States. 72% of non-Orthodox Jews who are getting married are intermarrying. We can talk about what that looks like and what that signals, et cetera, and what Q's just about that if you'd like. But when I was writing this chapter, it was really important to me to have a more welcoming, inclusive feel to it. I gave that chapter to several of my friends, both male and female, who are either involved with non-Jews or non-Jews who are involved with Jews, and got feedback from them on the content, on the tone, because I wanted this chapter to strike just the right balance so that it would be able to be understood and read and appreciated by any type of blended family, as well as by in-married couples. I think I succeeded with the tone. It's something I'm really proud of. I've had people who are in that situation read it and say, wow, I've never thought about some of this stuff. This was really, really helpful. I have a chapter on children's Jewish education and the B'nai Mitzvah process, which has become completely remixed over the past 10 to 15 years. And some of that remix is not necessarily great news for synagogues. And so I talk about some of that and the pros and the cons. I have a chapter on tikkun olam, as I mentioned before. I have a chapter on grandparenting. Some people tell me that chapter is worth the price of the whole book. That chapter is written in fiction style. I made up 3 couples, each with challenges in terms of their grandchildren and children and how they can go about actually facilitating, perpetuating Jewish tradition without overstepping the bounds of their children's priorities. And finally, I have a chapter on mourning, the mourning rituals, which are among the strongest in some ways in American Jewish communities. By that I mean, it's very rare, for example, to have no Shiva at all when a Jewish person dies. I've only seen that myself a couple of times, maybe once. And usually there's something. So there's something about those mourning rituals that has staying power, even in communities like Arizona, which I talk about, that has the least affiliated, least observant, groups of Jews among the least in the country. And then my epilogue talks about authenticity and faith. That's where I talk about faith in God and how that plays into it, as well as what some of the emergent Jewish institutions are doing. So I talk about some of the innovative institutions in that chapter. Mostly this book is about family practice, individual practice, and family practice. So I just want to close with a quote by Rob, who was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel before it became a state. And he was not talking about Remix Judaism, but his quote really does to me capture very much how Remix Judaism operates. So Rav Kook said as follows, I'll just say it first in Hebrew and then translate it. It's very short. Hayashan yitkadesh, the old shall become new. V'chachadash yitkadesh, and the new shall become sanctified. And I think that is very much how I see Remix Judaism. So with that, I would love to, again, we have a very small group. I'm hoping people will be comfortable asking questions or giving comments or bringing up topics that they'd like to explore further. Because anything, there's so much more to say about all of the topics that I brought up. So I'm going to just at this point open it up and see where people want to go.
You have a question. I know you just touched on intermarriage.
Yeah.
And I was going to bring it up because I would think that's very telling in terms of where Judaism is going, in the sense that the fact that I don't know if you see intermarriage is increasing a lot, or is it decreasing, or where is that in terms of the big picture?
Definitely not decreasing, it's definitely increasing. Both the 2000 Pew report as well as the 2020 Pew report had intermarriage at basically a stable rate, meaning, as I said, 72% of non-Orthodox Jews who are marrying are intermarrying. That's a high percentage. That means roughly, only, basically between 25, 30%, less than 30% of Jewish adults are choosing to marry Jewish outside of Orthodoxy. That's a very high percentage. What does that mean for Judaism? Data is like anything else. You can look at data any way you want, and people do. So let me give you an example of this. Now, again, I know that that this is a Reformed synagogue, and yes, the intermarriage rate is somewhat higher in Reformed Judaism than it is in Conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism is, however, increasing. So in Jewish philanthropy, I think where I stepped out, but over the past month, there were 2 interesting op-eds written. One was written by the interfaith specialist of the conservative movement. So conservative rabbis, by the way, are not allowed to intermarry. They are not allowed to perform intermarriages. Okay, you cannot do that. If you're a conservative rabbi, you're a member of their organization, the Rabbinical Assembly, you perform an intermarriage, you will be removed from the Rabbinical Assembly. They cannot do that. So, not having said that, the conservative movement just hired an interfaith specialist, someone to advise people in the synagogues like how to integrate their interfaith couples, right? And so an op-ed was written by their interfaith specialist, whose name is Dr. Karen McGinnity. I've actually interviewed her on my podcast called Remix for Judaism. And in that article, Professor McGinnity said that, essentially she spoke to the CEO of the conservative movement, named Jacob Blumenthal, and he said intermarriage is an opportunity for conservative Judaism.
Sorry, a little louder.
The CEO in this article, Dr. McGinnity, who is the interfaith specialist of the conservative movement, said, quoted Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, who's the CEO of the conservative movement. And he said, intermarriage is an opportunity for the conservative movement. Maybe a week, 2 weeks later at most, another op-ed came out by Professor Jack Wertheimer, who is a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary there, the conservative movement's flagship school in New York, saying the conservative movement does not need a narrative of intermarriage, right? So the question is, what does the data show? I will tell you what Pew shows, and Pew is very clear on this. Pew shows that among intermarried couples, we are seeing more, on the one hand, on the positive, on the glass half full, we are seeing more children of intermarried couples identify as Jewish. So when you say, like, how you identify or whatever, they'll say Jewish. More are. That is a good thing. But we are also seeing that among intermarried couples, the number raising their kids as Jewish by religion, not half and half, not half Jewish, half right, Jewish by religion, is maybe 20 to 25%. Among Jews who are in married, it's 98%. I think those statistics are pretty clear that intermarriage is tough for Jewish transmission. I think the narrative that we often hear as well, if we were more warm and we were more welcoming, maybe that's part of the narrative. But the other part of the narrative is you got to practice. And why aren't we talking more about conversion? And that's my criticism of the movement I was brought up in, right? I mean, every time I've had an opportunity to write about this, the people at the top of the food chain in the conservative movement got frustrated with me because I always said, let's talk more about conversion. Maybe make the standards easier, although they're not the same as they are. They're not as stringent as they are for Orthodoxy in the conservative movement. But let's talk more about conversion. Why isn't that the conversation? And I don't know why that isn't the conversation. I think it maybe should be the conversation. So to answer your question, it depends on who's answering that question, right? It depends,
I would think that's very telling,
Yeah.
to be honest with you, because the idea that people are willing to marry outside of the religion, I think does tell you quite a bit of how they feel about their religion.
Well, they would say no. All right. So if I were putting on my other hat, like if I were putting on a hat that was more looking at it as an opportunity. Okay. If I were putting on my opportunity hat, they would say, well, no, it doesn't tell you that. Okay. And people have written about this. They would say people fall in love with whom they fall in love with. And we can't change that. So it doesn't mean that they're rejecting religion. It doesn't mean they're rejecting their parents. It means they're falling in love with someone non-Jewish. I think that was Dr. McGinnity's, the interfaith specialist of the conservative movement. I think that was her narrative, her own personal narrative. She married someone who is not Jewish. She has one child. That kid went to day school. That kid has a serious Jewish education. Don't forget, Dr. McGinnity is also the mother, right? Under the law followed by the conservative movement, the child was Jewish. But let's talk about reform, because reform has manifested a very interesting journey when it comes to intermarriage. Very, very interesting. And I do want to mention, I was actually the honored to be on Dean Joshua Holo's podcast, The College Commons, which is produced by the Reform Movement. That one dropped on March 1st. And he and I had a wide-ranging discussion that covered somewhat intermarriage and a whole lot of other things pertaining to the book. It was such an honor to be with him. But the Reform movement is interesting. So in 1983, the Reform movement adopted the Patrilineal Resolution, which, as some of you may know, is basically made the decision that if either the mother or the father is Jewish, the child will be Jewish as long as the child manifested a positive Jewish identity. So the Reform movement argued at the time, they said, well, look, we're actually, we're saying that even if a mother is Jewish, it's not enough for reform. The child also has to have a positive Jewish identity, right? So the Reform movement was trying to position its Patrilineal Resolution as in some ways like actually reaching higher goals. It's not good enough to be Jewish anymore, right? Okay. And that was 1983. 1994, there was the Reform movement has a law committee. The head of your law committee in the reform movement is Rabbi Mark Wachowski, who's actually writing in the Oxford handbook that I'm editing, where I mentioned he's writing that position paper on reform halacha. He's a wonderful scholar. I love working with him. And the law committee that he heads in 1994 was faced with a question by a synagogue, a reform synagogue. Well, we've got a family. The mother is Catholic, the father is Jewish. They're raising their daughter Catholic, they're raising their son Jewish. They want to be members of the synagogue. And so the reform movement's Jewish law committee functions like the conservative movements. You know, the rabbis bring the questions to the law committee and the law committee debates and they give an answer, right? Okay. So the law committee debates in the reform movement, they debate, and what they decide is, well, the son is really not manifesting a positive Jewish identity because he's being raised in a home where his mother and sister are Catholic. That doesn't meet our criteria. So yes, the boy can be enrolled in Hebrew school. He can begin studying, but he's got to convert before his bar mitzvah. The father can also be a member because he's Jewish, but I think it said no leadership position. So that was 1994. It was a long time ago. Flash forward to today. Would that opinion come out today? And I've had that conversation with reform rabbis that I've spoken with during my journey over the past 2 years. I don't think so. I don't think that 1994 decision would look the same. And in the most recent study by the reform movement that came out just a couple of years ago, they surveyed their Hebrew schools. And of the respondents, the synagogues that responded, 20% of the children in Reform Hebrew schools, 20% are getting instruction in more than Judaism as a religion. So, so you can sort of look at the data and say, I don't know where we go with this, right? I don't know where we go with this. It depends on how you interpret the data and what you think the future of Judaism should look like. Part of the problem, too, is that society has become more liberal as a general matter, beyond Jews. Part of the problem is that religion is not prized and revered all across the way it has been. But the problem for us as Jews is, number one, we are a small people. There's very few of us. And in the United States, we live as a cultural minority, as a cultural religious minority, right? So in Israel, if you're not religious, and by the way, not religious in Israel looks different than not religious here as a Jew, but in Israel, it doesn't matter so much, right? Because you're living in a country that's just infused with Judaism all about. But if you're living in the United States, you've got to work harder to give your kids enough to carry it on. And frankly, that is true of in-married Jews, that low-hanging fruit that I talked about in my EJP op-ed. It's as true of those Jews as it is of intermarried Jews. Because even the in-married Jews, they're not sitting home observing Shabbat. They're not running, they're running errands on Shabbos. They're doing activities. If you can get them to do a Friday night celebration on a consistent basis, whether you're Reform or conservative or Reconstructionist Jews, that's pretty good. But yeah, we need to up it.
So certainly in this congregation, I think more generally, there's a lot of emphasis on community.
Yeah.
And synagogues, for example, is a source of community. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how ritual practice can be used to build a sense of community among Jewish children or grandchildren.
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, community is important. Look, Judaism is a communal religion, right? So, I mean, we know that from our davening, our praying practices, and all of our celebrations. I'd say it's a partnership between the synagogue and the home, right? If all the kids are getting is what they get in Hebrew school and not much else, you're not going to be successful. You're just not. It has to be. It's like what they were going back about my dad. We weren't the most religious family, but I knew it was important. The kids have to know it's important. So I do think, synagogue is important. Part of the problem is that, as we know, that Gen Z, they're not joiners. And the millennials, by and large, are not joiners. That's why synagogues have to really reach for that low-hanging fruit. So I, for example, and I said this in my EJP article, I said to my own synagogue, to NSS Beth Ellen Highland Park, look, you should be working with your realtor office. And when you hear of families, even if they're not Jewish, when you hear of families moving into the area, you should get their addresses. You should be sending a welcome package with little, logo of the synagogue saying, we're here for you, whatever. I mean, warm, welcoming, inclusive. Synagogues have to be doing a kind of outreach that wasn't necessary. Like when I was growing up, people joined synagogues. Even when we were raising our kids, people joined. Now, not so much. And it's not because of the money, because most synagogues, if you know anything about synagogue life, no one's ever turned away these days because they can't afford to pay, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about joining. It's about wanting to make that, a priority. And it's important. And again, my message to synagogues is, if we don't turn this around, what's your membership going to look like in 20 years? Because we're seeing declines, not just in the conservative movement, but in the Reform. It's across the board.
I think it's not just getting to join. We have a 35-year-old. We've been here 30 years. One thing I noticed when Eric was bar mitzvah in 1999, there was a lot of kids to name mitzvah that year.
Yeah.
How few of them stayed on? How few of the families stayed on?
Sure, absolutely.
After that, they want their kids bar mitzvah, and Lori probably even knows because she was here. How few of us are still here?
Yeah.
Although I have to tell you, we had a bat mitzvah here last week, and the sanctuary was filled with members of the congregation who were in the class with the mother, and who are all now members of the congregation. They were all my students. Lotus many years ago, and they now have re-engaged. So I actually think TBI, because we haven't moved, because we have this legacy of this child was a 5th generation member of the congregation. Sure. It's not all rosy, right? But I think we have positioned ourselves, and although, the pandemic has affected us like it's affected everyone else, and we now have a new rabbi who has...
She's a local woman.
She's a local woman. She also has a different view on interfaith families than our previous rabbi did. So I think we're going to see a different sort of engagement among that population. When I came here 28 years ago, we were maybe 20% interfaith. We are easily 50% now.
So while you were out, we were chatting about that issue. And, that can be looked at by that phenomenon, right? Can be looked at differently, because what Pew, you've read Pew, so you know what Pew says about interfaith families and what their practices.
1 second, Marcy. Sorry, to go run. I'm multitasking here this morning.
I was just thinking also, when we were younger, we were taught, I went to a Jewish parochial school, and we were taught that you don't question, you just do.
Yeah.
We don't question. We don't ask why we're supposed to be doing certain things. We just do it. And I think that's what's changed also, by the way, because young people today won't just do, they question. And I think that's a very well, except the Orthodox. For example, I'm just thinking about being kosher. How many people who are kosher know why you're not supposed to have milk and meat? I bet most people have no idea why that is supposed to be. And I think so much of Jewish law is based on just doing, and not just don't question, just do. And I think maybe that's why there's a falling off, because again, younger people won't just do, they question.
So I think that, and that's exactly, you're right, then people aren't going to just do, but that's exactly the beauty of bringing Judaism. The beauty of what I'm advocating is that you do it when it means something personal to you. It doesn't matter why Jews don't mix meat and milk. If you can find a personal reason for tapping into that, right? Or not eating meat at all, not eating a dairy at all, whatever it may be, right, you will do it. And I think that that's right. But I also think, in addition to, look, things were different. I think certainly, when my dad was growing up, right? My dad has passed, he died in 2010 at the age of 92. So he grew up in the Depression era, right? But in that era, he wasn't the most religious kid, but he had so much respect for his family. And that's fallen off a little bit. But even in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where many of us perhaps were growing up, it was still more obedience, I think, although I think the doors were opening for a different way. The problem is if we don't turn it around, right? I think we are really missing the lost. That is the lost opportunity, not turning this around. And not turning this around means we have to be clear with our kids and our grandkids why Jewish practice is important, even if it's not dotting the I's and crossing the T's of Jewish law, right? Even if it's kosher style, even if it's, whatever it may be. And I think there are plenty of young Jews out there. They are searching. They are spiritually searching. They need to be focused in that search on Judaism if we're going to have a Jewish future outside of Orthodoxy. And let me just also say, the need for a Jewish future outside of Orthodoxy, in my mind, transcends continuity of Judaism. Think about anti-Semitism, which somebody mentioned before. Who are most of the Jews that are doing all the advocacy work when it comes to anti-Semitism and when it comes to working with the Federation? They are by and large not Orthodox Jews, because Orthodox Jews have their own institutions and educational systems. They are by and large liberally religious Jews. What is that going to look like if that commitment fails to still be there? And what we do see, and P was very clear on this, the people that are least Jewishly engaged, they're at least Jewishly engaged when it comes to Israel. It's not so much the political situation, and there was an article just written about this recently. It's the reason Jews are disengaged from Israel is not so much the political situation, which we're not going to talk about here right now, but it's really more they're not engaged in Judaism. And the study, and P was clear on that one as well. So I think we just, I think generally we need to do that.
So you said something really interesting. You said they're not engaged in Judaism. Are they engaged in something else, or are they not engaged?
Oh, they're definitely engaged in other things. I just want to teach law students,
Yeah.
and I don't have a lot of Jewish students at DePaul, but we have some. They're not engaged in Judaism. They're engaged in politics.
Mm-hmm.
They're engaged in social justice, but not even coming at it from a Jewish perspective. They're engaged in environment. Now, all of that is not necessarily inconsistent with Judaism, but it's different from Jewish practice. Right. Yes, they are definitely engaged. They're a passionate generation. And you know what else is interesting about Gen Z, that youngest cohort born between 1995 and 2010? Who do you think their most trusted advisors are? Their parents. They're not a rebellious generation. They're very tough with their parents. The reason I know so much about Gen Z, my kids are millennials, but right before COVID, actually it was the day my book came out, my dean, Jen Rosado, who she loves to bring in speakers, or prior to COVID, we had them in person, and she brought in a Gen Z expert. She wanted us to understand the students we were teaching. So she brings in this Gen Z expert. It was probably the best lecture I think I've ever heard at DePaul. And this woman made a lot of points, like not related to our subject today, but she goes, they don't like to read. They're in sound bites. They don't like to read. Wow, that's why my students aren't reading. Okay, like the light bulbs go out, right? But yeah, their most trusted advisors are their parents. Gen Z are very tight with their parents. Not for their parents, Gen Xers. And that trend of not joining, that started with the Gen Xers, right? The baby boomers, by and large, they affiliated. Gen Xers, not so much. So again, we've got a lot of work to do. I think what Jewish communities, synagogues, organizations need to do is they need to focus on that low-hanging fruit, because they are there. They are here. They are in Chicago. That the name is Bob, that the Lord just talked about is an example with the parents of that B'nai Mitzvah is a great example of it. We need to be focusing on them. The message of a book like Remixed Judaism needs to be front and center, because that's the only way that people are going to practice for it. They're not going to do it because they're told to do it, because they're supposed to do it. That simply won't resonate.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being with you. I think the book is back there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm happy to sign books for anyone who would like. I'd love to do that for you. Maybe I'll be asked back on Mom's side.
Yes, please.
So we
It's that.
had,
It's 20.
your last comment reminded me, so really more generation at the time, but